kids are exposed to a lot of TV shows, books, games these days, and they're even exposed to things like LGBTQ, homosexuality, violence, cussing, sexual contents in a very young age. How do we raise up kids in this digital age? This session is not just only for people who are parents, but it's for even for people who has a love for kids and who are doing kids ministry. So this session is for you. We have Elizabeth with us. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining us all the way from US. We're so happy to have you here. For the people who aren't familiar with you and your ministry, just can you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, Elizabeth?
Yes, thanks so much for having me on today, Lloyd. It's a pleasure to be with you. So as Lloyd said, my name is Elizabeth Urbanowicz, and I'm coming to you from the US. And my background is in elementary education, so in teaching students that are 12 years old or younger. And I actually don't have children myself, but God has given me a heart for the next generation. And as I was teaching students at a Christian school in the United States, I noticed just a lot of what Lloyd mentioned before, that there are so many influences that are competing for the next generation's heart and mind. So God just gave me a passion for equipping the kids that he had placed in my care to think critically through every idea that they have encountered. So when I was teaching, I started to look for materials that would just teach the students in my care how to look at, okay, what is this idea that I've just been presented with, whether it's on a television show or a YouTube channel or a TikTok video or something that they just hear a friend say or, a neighbor or someone. And I couldn't find any materials that did that at the younger levels. I found things for high school or college students, which those resources are so valuable. But I thought, oh my goodness, if these 8 and 9 and 10-year-olds in my care are already absorbing false ideas, if we wait until they're 16, 17, 18 years old to begin addressing them, they're going to have so many faulty worldview ideas that we're going to need to tear down and rebuild up. So that's when God gave me a passion just for developing materials that parents and teachers and pastors and kids ministry workers can use with children to equip them to think critically and to think biblically. So that's a little bit about my background and my passion and why I'm here today.
Wow, that's so great. So when I was just reading about you in the net, I saw that you are a elementary teacher and you have a master's degree in apologetics. Wow, such a unique combination. So, what was the reason behind this whole thing? Yeah.
Yes, it is a unique combination to have a degree in elementary education and then apologetics. But I'm happy to say, I don't know about in India, but in the United States, it's becoming a little bit more common now. Not super common, but a little bit more common for people that are working with younger children to see the need for apologetics. And so I'm very grateful for that. And so the way that started is when I was looking for these resources to use with the children that God had placed in my care and I couldn't find anything, I said, well, I guess I can start to do some reading, start to watch some YouTube videos on apologetics. And then I started creating resources to use and to teach with the children in my classroom. And I was just hoping that they were going to stop and think, when they watched a YouTube video or when they watched a movie. And that started happening. Like moms of students in this class were calling me and they were saying, we have a family movie night every Friday and our child now wants to pause family movie night and evaluate the character's worldview. Like, this is great, but we don't know how to do this. Can you help us? And so that was really exciting for me because that's what I wanted. But what I didn't expect was that the children who were in this class were then really going to take ownership of their education. Now, I don't know, I haven't worked in an Indian school, so things might be somewhat different in India, but here in the United States, a lot of times kids are not very motivated to learn. They just take for granted, the fact that they're being given an education. But once these students in my class realized, wait a minute, not every piece of information is true. There's some things out there that are false, and I have a responsibility to discern whether this is true or false. They really took ownership of their education, and they started thinking through subjects like history and mathematics and literature, even more critically sometimes than their teachers. That teachers were coming down to my classroom saying, how are you getting these kids to think so critically? So when people heard what was going on, they got really excited about this, and they said, how can we get, your materials? And I was like, you can't, like, I'm
Yeah.
like a grade school teacher. I'm not a publishing house. Here are the books I read. Here are the YouTube videos I watched. You can go do that. And everyone was like, no, 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 we're not going to do that. Just tell us when you have this published. So when that kept happening for several years, I thought, okay, clearly there's a need here. So I decided that I was going to publish what I had created. But I knew that if I was going to publish something and it was going to be public, I needed to make sure that it was really accurate. So then I
Yeah.
thought, I need to make sure that I go and put myself through really rigorous training to make sure that I'm thinking correctly, that I'm appropriately translating these concepts. So that led to the master's in Christian apologetics,
Yeah.
which it was very challenging for me. Some people that enter into programs like that are very, very intelligent. That's not me. I'm not super intelligent. I just have a heart for helping children understand truth. So that's what led to the degree, and it was so beneficial. And it was just so exciting to be able to take these, really high intellectual, philosophical concepts that I was learning about, and then just translate them down to a level that a 7 or
Wow.
8 or 9-year-old could
Wow.
understand.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really important because when people talk about apologetics, they just really have a very high view that that's something that only
Mhm.
intelligent people who are very wise can only understand. But the way you are making it easier for even a kid to understand, that's brilliant. Praise God for that. So, for even before we dive into the session, just want to people who are new to this channel, we post contents related to theology, Christian living, apologetics, and we would love you to live a Christ-centered life, and we just want to equip you to spread the love of Christ to others. So, if you love if you want to really check out our other contents, just do check it out in our channel, and we're gonna post the links for Elizabeth's ministry in the description below. And if you really want to check out her contents, just go and just check that out. We'd really encourage you to do that. So even before I'm just going to ask you the first question now, Elizabeth. So how important is it to raise kids in a biblical worldview?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I would say for Christians, it's of the utmost
Yeah.
importance. That if we want to be faithful with what God has entrusted to us with these children, and whether they're our biological children or adoptive children, whether they're our spiritual children who are just in our community or our church or our school, passing on the faith to the next generation is of the utmost importance. And we need to understand, the world in which we're living. That's one thing that I love about the book of Acts is when we get into, in the second half of the book of Acts, when we look at the Apostle Paul's ministry, one thing that he was very careful about is that he always sought to understand the culture of the people that he was going and sharing the gospel with. And he would quote sometimes from their poets or from other people in their society. He would connect things to, the temples that they were going to, or, the statue to the unknown God. He would use things in their culture. He would use reasoning when he went, to talk to the Greeks, because he knew that was important to them. And so that's how he would spread the gospel. And it's the same way with the children that God has placed in our care. We need to understand the world in which these children are growing up. And because of the prevalence of information, if we want to raise our children with a biblical worldview, and again, when I say our children, I mean all the children God has placed in our care. If we want them to see everything through the lens of Scripture, we need to equip them to evaluate all these different ideas coming their way. So I would say raising children who have a biblical worldview is of the utmost importance. Now, what I focus on a lot in the Foundation Worldview Ministry is I focus a lot on spiritual formation or development of faith of the head, okay, of the intellect. And that's not the only element of faith. There's also faith of the heart, of our affections, of our desires for God, and faith of our hands, what we do, the way that we live our life. And all three components are equally important. All three are equally presented in scripture. Just the reason that I focus so much on the head is because that's what's often neglected. And that's where a lot of times our children get really tripped up, is they might have a heart and desire to follow Jesus, which we need to continue to cultivate, and they might want to do the things of God, which is of the utmost importance. But if they don't have that intellectual grounding of understanding that this is true, they can easily be swept into false ideas. So in summary, your question, I think that raising kids who have a biblical worldview is of the utmost importance in passing along the faith to the next generation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I think I don't know about in US, but in India, parents really pressurize or just force kids to really memorize scriptures, and they force I mean, I won't say force, but they really make kids to attend Sunday school and all these Bible classes and all of that. And these kids, they don't even get a chance to ask questions to their parents. So even before we go into that, can you just tell us how you will define a worldview to kids?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Anytime we're trying to explain something that's like very philosophical or abstract to a child, what we want to do is we want to attach it to something concrete. Now, I don't know if it's the same way in India, but in the United States, when we're teaching like a 3 or a 4-year-old about numbers, we can't just say the number 5 or can't just say the number 2, because that's an abstract concept. So what we usually do is we'll pull out something physical, like whether it's blocks or like little Legos or something, and we'll pull out 3 blocks, and then we'll practice with the child counting them. And that's how we teach them to add too. Like we might take out 3 blocks and 2 blocks, count them, and then put them together and add them. And eventually, once the child has seen that physically put together, then we can eventually just say 3 plus 2 equals 5, and they understand it. So it's the same way anytime when we're trying to explain something to a child. So a worldview is a very abstract concept. So the way that I like to explain it to a child, what I like to attach to it physically, is I say that a worldview is like a mental map of what we believe is true about life and the world around us. And so usually an activity that I'll have kids do is I'll have them look around the room, whatever room that we're in, and say, okay, now on this piece of paper, I want you to draw a map of this room. And I have them draw a map of the room, like where all the furniture and everything else is located. Then I have them turn the paper over and I say, okay, you just drew a true map. On the back, I want you to draw a false map. Okay, like you can rearrange the furniture or the windows or the doors. And so we'll look at the true map and the false map and say that's like our worldview. Our worldview is this mental map, this map that we have in our mind of what is true about life and the world around us. And then what I'll do is I'll say, okay, I want you to pretend that it's nighttime and it's dark out and it's dark in this room. And let's say that a fire started and who's ever in this room needed to get out of this room as quickly as they could. What would happen if the only map that they had in their mind of this room was your false map? And then we talk through, well, they might not make it out on time. If there was a fire, they might bump into the furniture. They might be looking for a door where there's only a wall. And then we talk about, okay, what would be different if this person knew the true map? Will they be much more likely to get out of the room in time to save themselves and to save anyone else? So that this way they understand that the way that we view the world, this worldview, it's really important that we have a true one. So I love to use the analogy of a map because it's something that kids can understand, whether it's a physical map or we talk about, there's GPS that we have on our iPhones, but that's still a map. So it's a concept that they can understand.
That makes a lot of sense. And the analogy and the illustration was brilliant. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for sharing that. Um, okay, my next question will be: how important is it to ask questions to kids and listen to them? Just listen.
Mhm.
How important is it? And can you just share your experience in your life?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question, Lloyd, because a lot of times we don't think about asking kids questions. We just think about telling them answers. And
Wow.
obviously, telling and teaching is still important. If we never told our children anything, they would be in big trouble. They wouldn't know to look before they cross the street, or they wouldn't know, not to put their hand in the fire or on a hot stove. So obviously telling is important. But like we mentioned before, since there's so much information coming our kids' way, we really
Mm,
want to train them to think well. And so it's vital that we ask our kids questions and that we really listen to them. Because one thing that brain researchers, as they research, how a child's brain and functions, has found that we learn the most when we're talking, actually, because we're processing the information. And so we see this even in Jesus's teaching. Jesus taught and he gave a lot of parables, and he also asked a lot of questions that a lot of times when people asked him questions, he responded with a question. And of course, he's the one that created our minds and our
mm,
brains. He's the one, that developed them. And so he knew how people learned the best. And so if we just tell our kids things, they're going to pick up some things, but a lot of what we say is just going to fall by the wayside. Where if we ask them questions, what we're then doing is we're then causing them to have to do the thinking. And
wow.
so that's really key. Now, when we ask our child a question, they might say, I don't know. and that's a possibility. But then that's an opportunity for us to say, okay, so you don't know that. Where do you think we could look to
Uh-huh.
find the answer to
Yeah.
that question? Because we're not always going to be there when our children have questions or when
Mhm.
they encounter different ideas. And this is something that I started to think through when I was teaching, because I taught mostly 8 and 9-year-olds. And developmentally, 8 and 9-year-olds, they're still at a phase where they will believe almost every word that you say. Once they turn 10, they're kind of like, why? The 10 and 11 years, that's when they're starting to ask why. And so I started to think, these children in my classroom right now, no matter what I tell them, they're going to believe that it's true.
Wow.
But what happens next year? What happens next year when they don't really care what I think? They don't really care what I say. Am I equipping them to seek truth on their own? So when we ask questions, we're starting to get them to think. And even if they don't know the answer, then we can equip them with tools for where can I go to find the answer. Because if we don't help them do that, they're going to figure it out on their own. And what they figure out might not be what's actually best for them. Just doing a blank Google search
Right.
for a question, who knows what kind of information is going to pop up on that first page.
Mm,
So I say asking our children questions is of the utmost importance to get them thinking, and then also equipping them with where can they go to find solid answers, and how can they evaluate that information that they find when they search for answers.
mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I have two follow-up questions, and the first one is,
Mhm.
what are some questions that you will ask? What are some questions that you will ask these kids, and how will you make them think?
Mhm. Yeah, so it depends on the time and the season and the kids that you're working with.
Yeah.
Right now, I develop resources for children, but the next generation that I work with most is I lead a discipleship group for girls at my church, and we meet every Sunday, and we're looking at how to study scripture. And so, an example that we're going to go through this week is I don't know about in India, but in the United States, when we celebrate Christmas, everything in the United States is about Santa Claus. And I was just watching a movie last week, a Christmas movie, where a father, a child is asking his father all sorts of questions about Santa Claus, like things that like don't make sense. And the father's like, sometimes faith means just believing without having any reasons for that. And I was like, whoa, okay. That's not what Christian worldview faith is about. So I'm going to show the girls in my discipleship group the clip from that movie. And then I'm going to ask them the question. I'm going to say, how is belief in Jesus similar to or different than belief in Santa Claus? And I'm going to give them some time to think through this, to talk through it together. And then I'm going to give them time to share, and we're going to talk through their answers. And then I'm going to show them a children's book that's about Santa Claus. And then I'm going to take them to the first chapter in Luke and have them look at what are the differences in these texts. The book about Santa Claus is obviously a fictitious book. Where then when we look at Luke, like he's writing and he's saying, like that he sought to put together an orderly account of all of the things that have happened. And then as we read that first chapter, we're going to see names and key events and places. And so looking at, this historical record of Jesus is completely different than these stories that we find about Santa Claus. So in that, I'm asking them a question. I'm giving them the opportunity to talk through it, to think through it. And then I'm providing them with some helpful information. And then I'm going to ask them that question again after we've gone through that, to ask them just to write down, 2 or 3 sentences for me. How is belief in Santa Claus similar to or different than belief in Jesus? And now these are the type of questions, that we can ask our kids, at any time. And so we can ask them, just thinking culturally, in India, in the United States, Hinduism and Islam are not nearly as prevalent, as they are in your area of the world. So that's even a question that could be asked, how are the teachings of Christianity similar to or different than the teachings of Hinduism? And we can ask that question. And at first, our children might be like, what are you talking about? I have no idea. But at least we've got them thinking. And then we can pull in resources, pull in different examples of religious texts or religious practices and have our children look through them. And then after we've discussed that, come back together again and then say, okay, now I want you to answer that question again. How are the teachings of Christianity similar to or different than the teachings of Hinduism? And we can do that in any area of life. We can look at, belief of what a human is. How is the belief that humans are just the product of blind, unguided evolution? How is that different than belief that humans are created in the image of God? Okay, so we can ask that question, get our kids thinking. Again, they might have really in-depth answers. They might surprise us, or they might have answers where we're like, oh my gosh, you're totally misled. I'm glad I asked this question. And then we have the opportunity to bring in other resources, do research with the kids, and then follow up with that question and say, okay, I want you to look at this again. How is belief that humans are the product of blind, unguided evolution? How is that similar to or different than belief that humans were purposefully created as God's image bearers? So these kind of questions can come up in any and every context. They can come up in the classroom, in the Sunday school classroom, in church, in the home, just in conversations, in the neighborhood, but just great opportunities to really get our kids thinking critically.
Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Follow-up question that I have is, you mentioned about the Christmas movie. Okay. So is overprotection a problem or not? Let me just expand, try to explain that a little bit. In India, parents don't really, encourage, a lot of Christian families don't really encourage kids to use mobile phones, YouTube, TV, or anything like that. So I mean, I can understand where they're coming from, or what their beliefs are and all of that. But is overprotection a problem or not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the way that you worded that. Is all protection a problem or not? Because obviously there are things out there online in culture all over the place that are just vile and evil that we don't want to just expose our children to. But then what does it mean to protect them? And so I like to say that protection of our children does not equal complete isolation. It equals preparation. And now this is going to look different for different families, but the example that I like to use is actually an example from my own life. So I don't know if this term is popular in India or not, but it is in the United States. I am a germaphobe in that, like, I am scared of germs. So I just get really easily grossed out by, like by things that are germy. And when I started teaching, here in the United States, when people start teaching, they'll tell you that your first year of teaching, you're going to get sick a ton because you're around little kids all the time who just carry germs. And I got sick a ton my first year of teaching. But then my second year of teaching, when I should have been immune, I started getting sick even more. And then my third year of teaching, when I should have been fine, I got sick even more. And I went to the doctor and I said, okay, something is not right here. Something isn't right. Like, I should be immune by now. And so the doctor just asked me a few questions about what I was doing. And one thing that he found is that hand sanitizer, like, like the gel that you just put on your hands when you can't wash them, I was using it all the time, like probably like 50 times a day, because like anything I touched something that my students were touching, like I put this hand sanitizer on my hands. And he said, hand sanitizer is beneficial before you're going to eat something and before you like rub your eyes, so you're not getting all of the bacteria and viruses in there. But he said, but if you use it that many times per day, what you're doing is you're also killing the good bacteria on your hands. So you're not giving your immune system time to be exposed to these germs in small doses. So he said, I only want you to use hand sanitizer before you eat and before you rub your eyes. And the amazing thing that happened is I stopped getting sick. And I was like, oh my goodness. But it's very similar like that with our children, that if we completely sanitize and protect them from every single influence of the world, we're not preparing them to live in this world that God has called us to right now. And so if we're not preparing them in small, healthy doses to be exposed to some of the teachings of this world, what we're doing is we're not creating a healthy biblical immune system, in that we're just leaving them very vulnerable for the days when they're outside of our homes or our churches or our classrooms. So what I like to suggest that parents and pastors and teachers do is to expose our children to the teachings of the world in very safe environments, at the time when they're still within our homes and within our churches and within our schools, and to train them then to evaluate these ideas. So like this movie that I was watching, I think so. It was just, it was a movie from a long time ago by Disney. It was just the Santa Claus. And I would recommend that parents or teachers or, pastors, that they think about showing a movie like that to the children in their care, and then talking through it and evaluating, okay, the way that faith was presented as this blind trust. You don't need any evidence. If you just believe enough, it's going to come true. Let's look at faith in the Bible. Is that how the Bible describes faith? And then looking at passages in scripture that talk about faith, because especially when we look at the Gospels, when Jesus commends people for their faith, it's not that Jesus is patting them on the back for having this blind, irrational trust. It's that Jesus is commending them for putting their trust in him where all the evidence leads. That Jesus was doing all of these signs and wonders and saying, look at this evidence. We see that even, when John the Baptist was imprisoned, when he sent his disciples to Jesus saying, are you the one that is to come, or should we look for someone else? Jesus didn't say, John, just tell John to trust me. Just tell him to put his faith in me. He said, look at what's going on. The lame are walking, the blind are receiving their sight, the deaf are hearing. Like, this is the poor are having good news preached to them. And so he's saying, look at all these things that were prophesied about are being fulfilled in me. Now go put your trust in me. So I say that it's really important that we expose our kids in small, healthy doses to what's going on in the world around us and equip them to evaluate it. Because if we don't, we're really leaving them in a very vulnerable position that once they're teenagers or once they're young adults, they're not going to understand how to carefully evaluate all of the ideas in our culture, and they're not going to be equipped to carefully think through them and whether or not they're true.
True. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Yeah. So my follow-up question will be: is there any model to is there any particular topics that we need to cover, or particular topics like, for example, topics like truth, is truth objective or subjective, topics like that. So do you have any model that you will follow when you engage, or when you train, or when you raise kids?
Yes. So I'll share with you what I do. And I always want to be careful when I'm speaking cross culturally because, I'm living day in and day out here in the United States. And because of media and because media, crosses cultures and countries all the time, there are some things that are going to be similar, but there are some things that might be different. So I'll share with you what I usually say is important here in the United States.
Sure.
But I would say take that model and think through then, okay, what are children being faced with in India? Some of it might be similar, some of it might be different. So what you mentioned first about the difference between objective truth claims that are either true or false and subjective preference claims, here in the United States, that's a huge thing. I don't know if it's the same way in India, but a lot of what's going on in our culture, especially because the United States is this melting pot, of people from all over and all different backgrounds, the narrative is, everyone has their own version of the truth. What's true for you might not be true for me or for the next person. What's really important is that we just respect and tolerate everyone and not force our version of the truth on them. So here in the United States, what I really encourage parents to do is from a very young age to teach kids to discern the difference between claims, okay, so statements that are made that are objective, that are either true or false, versus subjective statements that are made that are they're going to be different from person to person, like our preference of food or our preference of weather or our preference of things that we enjoy to do. Like those are things that are going to change from person to person, where any claim that can't be made true or false based on my feelings, based on my inner desires or thoughts, that's an objective claim. Like in the United States, kids and even adults get so confused by when you say the claim God exists or God doesn't exist. That say, well, maybe that's true for you, okay, but it's not true for me. Where it's like, okay, can my thoughts make God pop into existence? Or can someone else's thoughts make God pop out of existence? No, either God exists, like God or gods exist, or God or gods don't exist. Like my personal feelings or belief about a God or gods have nothing to do or have no power over whether or not they exist. So truth is of the utmost importance. So when working with older kids, like 8 years old or older, I teach them the actual terms, objective truth claims. And I go like this because it's something that's outside of me. I can't change it based on my preferences or beliefs, versus subjective preference claims. And with older kids, I'll give them a sentence, okay, like saying like the earth is round. And I'll say, okay, is that an objective claim that's either true or false? Or is it a subjective claim that's just based on personal preference? And I'll have them talk through, okay, what is that claim? And I'll give them a bunch of different ones. For little kids, so for like 7 and younger, we just talk about the difference between truth. And so I stick our thumbs up, truth, not truth. Okay. So we'll have like our hands like an X, or then feelings, and we'll just hug ourselves. So that's what I'll do with little kids. And I'll give them really simple sentences, just to think about, is this true, not true, or is this a feeling? Like I might say something like ice cream is delicious. Okay. And then I'll have them hug themselves and say feeling. So they understand that, like for some people, ice cream is delicious. For other people, it's not their favorite. And then I'll give them silly sentences that they know are not true. Like I'll say like dogs run on the ceiling, something silly that's like very obviously not true. And I'll have them hold their hands up in an X and go, not true. Or then I'll give them a true statement, like Monday is a day of the week, and they'll hold their, they'll hold their thumbs up. So that's something that's really, really important, especially if we want our children to understand the truth of Christianity. Like Christianity rests on the claim that Jesus rose from the grave. And, Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 15, that if Christ has not been raised, we're still in our sins and our faith is futile. And if in this life we have hope in Christ, we're of all people most to be pitied. Like we're wasting our lives. Like if I was going to make up a religion, I would not make up Christianity, like where I have to die to myself daily. Like, no, thank you. I'm going to make up another kind of religion. But we want our kids to know that either Jesus rose from the grave and he's alive, or he did not and he's dead. And so it's not like, yeah, Christianity is true for me, but not necessarily for you. It's like, no, either Christianity is true or it's false. So I would say the concept of truth is of the utmost importance. And then in the United States, another thing that's big right now is what it means to be human. Okay. So when we think about, especially like gender and sexuality and what that means, and are our bodies actually part of us? Are they an important part of us, or are our bodies just kind of like this husk, this shell that doesn't really matter, and we can change our bodies, to be whoever we want to be? And so an activity that I like to do with kids to get them to understand that our bodies are really important parts of us, but that we also have this soul, that keeps us the same person, is I'll take pictures of myself from different stages of my development, from when I was a baby to when I was in elementary school to when I was in high school and college and now as an adult. And we'll look and we'll talk about how my body has changed. Like, oh my goodness, look I was bald when I was born. I didn't have any hair, or like, oh, look at that picture. I didn't have any front teeth then. And we talk about, but is that still Elizabeth Urbanowicz? Yes. Like, oh my goodness, that means there must be more to me than just my body. But then we'll talk about like, okay, is my body an important part of me? Like, would I be different if I didn't have a body, or if I had a different body? Yes. Like this body is an important part of me. So that's another concept here in the United States that's really important, just helping our kids understand what it means to be human. And that we're both body and soul, and that the two are intimately entwined, and that they're both part of bearing God's image. So those are two things here in the United States that are really important to cover.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that, Elizabeth. So the next question, even before I move on to the next question, I just want to share something. The people who are watching this video, the reason for doing this session is because I've been looking at a lot of churches, a lot of Christian kids who are just walking away from their faith. They are just raised in a Christian family. They were part of a Christian family, and after a point of time, they even they are part of the worship team. They are part of the choir in the church, and after 18 or above, they just move out away from their faith. And I when I was just thinking about all these things, I just realized that we as people who are elders made some mistake, and I think we should have shared these things to them when they were quite younger. So I think, don't you think so, Elizabeth? So people are just deconstructing their faith and all of that. I think this is one of the reasons, right?
Yes, this is one of the reasons that young adults or even teens walk away from the faith. Now we can pursue our children's hearts. We can't change them. Only God can take a heart of stone and give us a heart of flesh. But what we can do is we can help remove some of those intellectual barriers, and helping them see that this is not a blind faith. This is not something that we believe just because our parents or our grandparents or whoever has believed it, but that Christianity actually shows us the truth about reality. So we want it to be that if our children, if they grow up and they walk away from the faith, it's not because we failed to show them that it's true. It's
Mm,
because, like, their hearts are hard and we really need to pray for them and continue to seek relationship with them. But we
sure.
want them, if they walk away from the faith, to understand that what they're walking away from is the truth.
Wow. I mean, I think I was just watching an interview, by Sean McDowell, and he was sharing about how, even when we raise up kids, we need to just show the selfless love that Christ showed.
Mm-hmm.
Even when they walk away from the faith, we're
Mm-hmm.
just gonna tell them, "Hey, I'm gonna love you," even though you just
Mm-hmm.
walk away from your faith.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the core message, and I think that's very important in
Mm-hmm.
this whole process of raising kids. Thank you so
Yes.
much, Elizabeth, for sharing that. I have a final question for you. What are some practical strategies that you will give, not just for the parents, but for anyone who is influencing a child?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Yeah,
practical strategies always
yeah,
important. We don't want to just talk about things and have them
yeah,
be ideas up here. We want to
yeah.
be able to implement them with children. Well, some of them are things that we've already talked about. Just the importance of asking good questions. And now
Mhm,
sometimes these questions, they might come up, just as we're having conversations, but I always encourage adults to think of questions ahead of time. Now, it doesn't mean we need to fire a whole long list of questions at children at once, but even just to sit down and think through and to pray through, okay, what are important questions for me to ask these children that God has placed in my care, to think of them ahead of time, to also think of the answers to them. Because sometimes we might think of really great questions, and then if someone asks us, well, how would you answer that? We might say, ooh, I don't know. So to think of really great questions, to ask them, to get them thinking, to also think through, how would we answer those questions? So that's one strategy. Another one that I encourage is to think through, how can we take, abstract concepts, whether it's truth or the concept of life or the concept of God or the concept of morals or what it means to be human. How can we take that concept and attach it to something concrete? Because young children are always going to understand it much better when we take it
mm,
and attach it to something concrete. So that's something. I know you said you'd put information out about Foundation Worldview, but
mm,
for the listeners, if you go to foundationworldview.com, we have curriculums that do that, but we also just have free blog content and webinars where we kind of walk through different things and how can we take something abstract and attach it to something concrete, because we want to provide people with helpful resources there. um, Another thing that I always recommend is thinking through, okay, how can we continue to develop relationship with these children so that they're comfortable coming to us with their questions. So it's really important that we seek to engage them intellectually and get them thinking. And we also need to make sure that we're engaging their hearts, because our children aren't really going to be willing to share the thoughts of their mind with us if they don't feel like we care about them as a person. So I just really encourage people to continue developing relationships. And this looks different with an 8-year-old than it does with an 18-year-old. um, but just to continue asking for wisdom from the Lord of, how can I show this child in my life that I love him or her, and that I care about him or her, and that I'm there for
mm,
him or her. So that's something that's really important, that yes, we need to engage the mind, and it's an area that we've kind of failed in a lot of
mm.
ways in the past, but we can't do that well if we're not really pursuing the hearts of the children that God has placed in our care. So those are some things that I really recommend: the asking questions, to really get our kids thinking, then to make sure that we're taking these abstract concepts and attaching them to something concrete, and then to make sure that we're pursuing our children's hearts, because we don't know the journey that God has them on. We, of course, we want all of our children, to make a commitment to follow Jesus from when they're really young and then live that out their entire lives. That would be the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
But it might be that this child, needs until they're 23 or 35 or 42, who knows, how long before they really come to a place where they repent of their sin and they surrender to Jesus and they're reconciled to him. And so we want to
Mm.
make sure that we're always keeping that relationship open, so that we can be part of that process that God has them on.
Wow, wow. Thank you so much for answering all our questions, Elizabeth, and for joining us today. It's such a
My
we're so
pleasure.
grateful to have you here. And for the people who are listening to this entire live, I just want to tell you guys that I want to encourage you guys to just go check out our content. We're just going to put the all the links in the description below. You can just check that out. And if you're new to this channel, you can just check out our other videos too. We'll be posting contents related to apologetics, theology, and Christian living, and much more. And just don't just let's not just be hearers of his words, just readers of his word, but be doers of his words. With
Amen.
that, we just want to close this session. Thank you guys for watching, and thank you so much, Elizabeth.
My pleasure.
Yeah, just give me a second. I'll just
Okay.
close the recording. Awesome. Yeah, thank you.